everyone, I'm Neve. In this episode of Study Your Screen podcast, we will be discussing mediated diversity, as well as mediated representation, but more specifically, how bodily autonomy is represented throughout media texts. In this episode, we'll be discussing The Handmaid's Tale 2017, produced by Bruce Miller based off of Margaret Atwood's 1985 novel, The Handmaid's Tale. We'll be looking at different scenes and specific scenes from the show and how they apply to real-life events, both recent and past. We'll also be covering academic sources and linking it to the research and content of the show in order to help us study our screens. Let's get started. So what does mediated diversity actually refer to? Well, it refers to not only how diversity is represented throughout texts, but also how it's not. Representation across all formats is crucial in exercising political and social rights, most notably across media such as film or television, much like we'll be discussing today. Both mediation and diversity are entities of their own. As discussed by Silverstone 2006, mediation refers to what medias do and to what we do with the media. It's a term that defines the media, both the media of mass communication, such as radio, television, and the World Wide Web, but also the press. Diversity, as discussed by the Diversity Task Force 2001, defines it as being all characteristics and experiences that define us. This idea of representation and diversity includes, but is of course not limited to, depictions of gender, sex, race, age, sexual orientation, beliefs and political stances, and religions. So that moves us on to mediated representation. What is it? Nick Coultree describes mediated representation as being part of a larger social practice that locates us and connects us to one another. It offers the potential for mutual recognition, and at the same time, they do not guarantee that we see or experience the same. Again, this highlights the social implications surrounding representation and its focuses. Rosalind Gill discusses the fascination and hyperfocus that post-feminist media has on the female experience, and how one of the most striking aspects of post-feminist media culture is its obsessional preoccupation with the body. How does any of this apply to The Handmaid's Tale? In order to understand this media text narratives and associations with bodily autonomy as a concept, we must first understand bodily autonomy, as well as what the context of the show wishes to represent and portray. Handmaid's Tale, adapted from Margaret Atwood's 1985 novel, follows June Osborne, a woman from the former USA, now called Gilead. In Gilead, women's positions are defined by their fertility or lack of. June is forced into the role of becoming a handmaid, forced to bear children and use her already established fertility to provide children for the elites. For instance, the high commanders and their wives. Gilead is a theocracy, created after the fallout of a catastrophic environmental crisis, which led to the decline in fertility rate and other health factors within the states. Fathered by Fred Waterford and Serena Joy, his wife, following the environmental collapse, the Civil War led to the establishment of this regime, described by Macaulay as being a dystopian society, a totalitarian regime that has risen in the future in America. Fred Waterford and Serena Joy become central figures in this new Christian fundamentalist nation, and June, now named Offred, is assigned to their household. This fertility crisis described within the television show is exaggerated upon, however it does root its ideas in truth. In fact, its roots are in statistics. According to multiple sources, such as CBS News, the fertility rate in the US dropped to an all-time low in 2024, with fewer than 1.6 children being born per woman. Looking at the USA as a foundation to the new Gilead regime, and in a real-life context, Brian Robbie's work further describes this decline as occurring at a remarkable speed. The global increase to readily available contraceptives and pregnancy preventatives has steadily developed. Robbie discusses his understanding around this topic, describing the beneficial aspects of contraceptives and support being adopted by both developing countries and third world countries, stating that developing countries appear to have benefited from the growing influence and scope of family planning programs, from new contraceptive technologies, and from the educational power of mass media. This link between bodily autonomy and the declining birth rates is not lost. However, this is not necessarily negative, particularly not in the eyes of women around the globe, especially in the USA. Without Bodily Autonomy, We Are Not Free, by Colleen P. Judge, discusses the potential fallout following the 2016 presidential election in the USA, in which Donald Trump was elected, and the potentially dramatic effects which the outcome may have on women's bodily autonomy and their right to prenatal healthcare, both those seeking abortions or continuing on with their pregnancies. Women describe their fears, particularly loss of bodily autonomy, stating that women express considerable fear and uncertainty regarding access to contraception and abortion. The threat surrounding potential restricted access to affordable contraception and abortion with limitation to bodily autonomy was described as placing a limitation on women's fundamental rights. When discussing the United States and women's bodily autonomy, it's important to not only discuss this as a whole, but also look at a representation of individuals. For instance, how women of colour and lower socioeconomic backgrounds are treated throughout these processes. From the same research article, statistics were provided. Mean age of 28 years old. 85% were white, 88% had at least a college degree. This disparity between women of colour and the mentioned statistics is extremely telling. Mediated representation and diversity are crucial factors to include within media texts in order to raise a voice for those otherwise unwritten, unseen and undepicted. During Trump's first presidency, the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. This sent massive shockwaves not only in the USA but globally. This set a precedent for media texts and materials alike to depict such situations within their work. During his second presidency, this fear has seemingly continued to get worse, as seen in some recent cases, like that of Adriana Smith. Adriana, an African-American female, was declared brain dead in February of 2025 after being dismissed by multiple medical professionals who dismissed her medical needs. Adriana was pregnant at this time and was forced to carry the child to term in order to comply with Georgia's strict anti-abortion laws, as stated by PBS. Unfortunately, a very similar scenario was early depicted in The Handmaid's Tale, and shows, unfortunately, that media reflects real life. We're now going to dive into the analysis of the show in order to consider how these contemporary discourses of representation of women's bodily autonomy are depicted and registered throughout media texts. One particular scene that depicts these issues is that in Season 3 of Episode 9, poignantly titled Heroic, this episode features a young black woman, Natalie, known as of Matthew in her role as a handmaid. She is, as we come to find out, forcibly pregnant with a commander's child. After experiencing a life-threatening seizure, one that will kill her without life support, she's artificially kept alive, as if no more than a vessel to incubate the unborn child. This episode sees Offred, of Matthew's walking partner and also the main character of the show, also forcibly being made to stay by her side. She remains in the clinical environment of the hospital room at the side of Matthew, listening to the male doctors discuss her as no more than merely a vessel to deliver the child, waiting to be set free herself, to return to her normalcy. Of Matthew eventually gives birth, directly followed by her immediately being taken off of life support, signifying the disposableness of these women. Having a show like this one that is able to focus almost entirely on the experience of women is crucial. The show is both politically and socially charged. The contents are not far from occurring, although exaggerated in both the novel and the show. The events throughout both texts are dramatised versions of events, but are, however, grounded in truth. Margaret Atwood, the original author of the 1985 novel, explains the basis of which she wrote the book. The Handmaid's Tale includes nothing that doesn't have a precedent in history or real life right now. They are human history themes. Examples of this can be seen throughout the show and are hard to miss, such as the ideology of which the foundations of the show is built upon, its characters and stories, such as population control, rebuilding and child abduction. The ideological hegemony of Gilead takes precedence, and we can see this occurring in the pilot episode of Season 1, Episode 1. Simply titled Offred, we follow June Osborne, who is seen running through the woods with her young daughter Hannah. They're trying to escape, avoiding being captured by the new Gilead regime, who plan to make use of June's proven fertility and abduct her child to be adopted by a high-ranking Gilead officer and his wife. The roots of this scene are, again, taken from real-world offences, for instance the baby scoop era. This period primarily took place from the end of the Second World War, 1945, until the 1970s, when there were more unmarried women having children out of wedlock, characterised by an increasing rate of premarital pregnancies over the period, with a higher rate of newborn adoptions, as taken from baby scoop era. The popularity of this show is no coincidence either. The level of returning viewership for the show is monumental, with the series finale gathering 4.4 million views in the US in the first 7 days alone. This is a 22% increase to the premiere episodes of Season 6, as stated by Bastidas. The realistic depiction of events is what frequents the show's viewers, even for myself. Aldous Huxley, best known for his novel Brave New World 1932, argues that in order for future world-predicting books to be of interest to us, we must first find some truth, stating that whatever its artistic or philosophical qualities, a book about the future can interest us only if its prophecies look as though they may conceivably come true. Although this sentiment holds true for many other media texts, we know that The Handmaid's Tale does not prophesise, it simply expands on the truth we already have established, and on events that have happened and that are still happening. The diverse representation seen throughout is what holds my attention. People see themselves, sometimes in extremely uncomfortable situations, but they are able to understand the value it holds. Rosalind Jill discusses femininity as a bodily property, further expanding on the female experience and lack of varied representation. This discussion of shifts of viewers and representation is applicable to the entire show. She states that shifts from earlier representational practices appear that femininity is defined as a bodily property, rather than a social, structural, or psychological one. Throughout The Handmaid's Tale, this particular aspect, as theorised by Jill, is distilled to a deeply oppressive form. A person's femininity is often refined to a person's ability to have children, almost as if women are objects to be used and commodified and surveilled. Women are objective versions of themselves. Moving on to discuss another core foundation seen embedded throughout this text is surveillance. Throughout the show, viewers see the loss of bodily autonomy in multiple ways, such as through the clothing the women are made to wear, how they grease each other and their higher-ups, their requirement to shop for families, and need to walk everywhere in plain sight. Everything is patrolled, and conformity is insisted upon. Jill states that surveillance of women's bodies, but not men's, constitutes perhaps the largest type of media context across all genres and formats. This contrasting scrutiny faced by the women is a prevalent topic seen across the whole scope of media. Imaginably, this affects the women more than the men, but not in the way it might be expected. All women, for instance, such as commanders' wives and the aunts and Marthas, are all objectified. They're all placed in this world to serve men for different purposes. Women of all socio-economic backgrounds, races, ages and ethnicities are represented throughout the show. They are scrutinised and controlled by those very same people forcing them to live in this dystopia, and are harboured for what is societally expected of them, rather than what they have to offer as individuals. The classification and surveillance of all women in the show forces division and creates hatred amongst them to each other, and towards themselves. Jill discusses how women's bodies are dissected apart by women as well as men, and are always at risk of failing. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I truly hope you were able to gain some insights into The Handmaid's Tale and the relevance it has and will continue to have as a form of mediated representation and diversity in today's society. Hope to speak to you again soon. Thanks!